All right, I didn't bring enough handouts, so what we're going to do is give them to, I don't know, every second or third person so you can look over at it and share. So if that works for you. And again, my paper is not the one that was, there was a confusion, I don't know what happened, but I'm going to speak on the modal argument and a rejoinder to contingent physicalism. Philosophy is experiencing a resurgence of property and substance dualism. Now, one important argument for substance dualism that has played a role in this resurgence is some version or other of a modal argument. In what follows, I present and clarify one form of the argument and defend a crucial premise with a focus on important defeaters proffered by the best known and, in my opinion, the most articulate advocate of contingent physicalism, Trenton Merricks. A modal argument for substance dualism, a statement of the argument. The modal argument has its roots in Descartes. But since then, several different modal arguments have been formulated, but I'll focus on one specific form. I'm not implying that the other forms are not appropriate. It's just not my purpose to survey various versions, and instead, by presenting my own form of the argument, I can focus on a specific premise that has recently come under attack. Let SS be a wholly spiritual substance, for example, a soul, and PO be a wholly physical object. Here's the argument. 1, the indiscernibility of identicals and the necessity of identity. 2, POs are essentially wholly and intrinsically physical, and SS's are essentially wholly and intrinsically immaterial. 3, possibly I exist and no POs exist. 4, my body, my physical body, is a PO. Therefore, possibly, I exist without my physical body existing. Therefore, it is not the case that I am essentially wholly and intrinsically my body, my physical body, or any other wholly physical object. I am essentially wholly and intrinsically either a PO or an SS. Therefore, I am essentially wholly and intrinsically an SS. So, clarification of the argument. Certain clarifications are in order. In premise 1, X and Y take Kripkean rigid designators or Swinburnian informative rigid designators as substitutions. Thus, 1 expresses de re and not de dicto reference and modality. I will take up a defense of the essentialist part of 2 below. But here I want to clarify intrinsically. This is meant to capture the idea that what makes a PO physical are the physical natures of the constituents, properties, property instances, relations, relation instances, parts, stuff, events, processes that, quote, make up a PO, that are inherent in its being. With proper substitution, the same goes for spiritual substances. Finally, I take is a constituent of to be unanalyzable and primitive. In 3, 4, and following, the terms I, PO, and my physical body are de re rigid designators. I don't like calling my physical body using my physical body because my is an indexical possessive adjective, and I agree with those who take the nominative pronoun I and the possessive adjective my to be pure indexicals. Secunda facie, they seem to be unique kinds of rigid designators, singular referring terms that refer to sui generis, irreducible, non-physical, and in these 2 cases, mental entities. Thus, designating something as my body is to already adopt a mental ontology as an aspect of the referent. But I set this issue aside and for convenience and conformity with standard statements of modal arguments for substance dualism, and here I mean a generic substance dualism that we've defined earlier in the book, I shall retain my physical body. And finally, along with many philosophers, I take terms such as I and my to be implements of direct reference. And when used to express beliefs, for example, that I am tired, they express de re, sometimes called de se, beliefs. Regarding 7, if we limit our domain of discourse to strictly physicalist views and various substance dualist views of the subject of consciousness, the I and the physical body, then 7 is an exhaustive dilemma. If we remove such a limitation, 7, though not exhaustive, still captures the live options for most who support or reject the modal argument. So I set aside other options, for example, contemporary idealism and panpsychism, for convenience. Let us grant 7 and our limited focus for the sake of argument. I am assuming 1, 4, and 7. 5 follows from 3 and 4. 6 follows from 2 and 5. And 8 follows from 6 and 7. Premises 2 and 3 are the main premises subject to attack. In what follows, I defend premise 2 and respond to sophisticated defeaters of 2 proffered by Merrick's. For a long time, the premise of the modal argument that was the focus of attack was 3. Possibly, I exist and no POs exist. The main issue was modal skepticism about the move from conceivability to metaphysical possibility. Now, so important as issues regarding 3 are, and we do address those in our book, Brandon and I do, I want to set them aside and focus on 2. In recent years, 2 has come under attack. If this attack is successful, it renders 3 irrelevant for a successful advocation of the modal argument. Defense of the argument against Merrick's contingent physicalism. Contingent physicalism and premise 2. The vast majority of philosophers would embrace the notion that wholly physical and wholly mental particulars are as such essentially. There is no possible world, W1 and W2, such that an object is a physical object, wholly physical object in W1, and a wholly non-physical object in W2. And similarly with an object that is an SS in W1. Speaking of whether physical objects, e.g. a bronze statue, could exist without being physical, Jaegwon Kim asserts what most take to be obvious. Quote, the answer seems a clear no. If anything is a material object, being material is a part of its essential nature. It cannot exist without being a material object. Universal agreement in philosophy is very hard to vouchsafe. However, though I may be wrong, I think we get as close to this compared to other philosophical topics regarding the claim that wholly physical and wholly mental particulars are such essentially. I'm not merely counting votes in making this point. Rather, claims like Kim's are so obvious to so many philosophers that dissenters face a stiff burden of proof. In fact, Kim just asserts it without any argument whatsoever, and he never does that, does he? And he does in this case because he doesn't think there needs to be an argument. It's just obvious to everybody reading his books. Nevertheless, Merrick's demurs and accepts contingent physicalism, which entails that an object could be wholly physical in the actual world, but wholly immaterial in another world. Contingent physicalism. Given some object S in possible worlds W1 and W2, X is a PO in W1, and X is an SS in W2. Those of you that are standing outside, you can come in and sit in the aisle if you'd like to, or come down and give me money. I'm always open to that. All right. It follows from contingent physicalism that the physicality of a wholly physical object is not essential to it. Merrick's develops this contingent physicalism in the context of defeating premise 2 of the modal argument. And Merrick's begins with a consideration of this argument. 1. For all x and y, If X is identical to Y, then X is necessarily identical to Y. 2, possibly, I exist and no physical thing exists. 3, I am identical with my physical body. Now, the dualist employs 1 and 2 to establish the negation of 3. Merrick's seeks to block the inference from 2 to the negation of 3, and he claims the inference actually rests on 4. M, my body, is essentially a physical thing. Unfortunately, says Merrick, there is no argument for 4. Well, now consider 5. Possibly, M, my body, exists, and no physical thing exists. Premise 5 entails the denial of 4, my body being essentially physical, and deciding on which to adopt depends upon arguments and judgments regarding the acceptance of 3 or 4. The contingent physicalist will prefer 3 and also accept 1 and 2. From the fact that there is a possible world in which I exist and no physical thing exists, it does not follow that in the actual world I am not identical to my physical body. But what if someone argues that 4 is intuitively evident and properly basic? Merrick responds that 4 actually rests on 7. 7, it is necessarily true that a body is a physical thing, and that supports M, my body is essentially a physical thing. But, says Merrick, 4 doesn't follow from 7, as can be seen in this counterexample. It is necessarily true that the President of the United States is a member of the executive branch of the American government, but this does not entail that Bill Clinton is essentially a member of the executive branch. Now, given that we have strong arguments and empirical evidence, split brain phenomena, problems with mental and physical correlations, and modal intuitions, for example, we have strong modal intuitions that mental-physical interaction is impossible, so we have this evidence against 4 and 4-3. And given that we only have very weak intuitions for 3, that I'm identical with my body, we have very weak intuitions against that. The physicalist should adopt 3 and give up 4, even though the modal argument for substance dualism may persuade those half convinced of substance dualism or strengthen the faith of substance dualists. While this is a creative argument, I think it suffers from serious problems. First, the substance dualist can hold to 4, my body is essentially a physical object, and hold that it is properly basic and grounded in very strong modal seemings. Now, this need not be a mere question-begging or groundless assertion. For example, Husserl, see below, has provided a detailed account of how we procure the relevant intuitions that provide access internalist grounds for 4. The epistemic ground for 4 is not propositional knowledge, but a non-conceptual, subcategorial, intuitive awareness or apprehension of the features of formal ontology, namely the formal ontological category material object, characteristic of one's body. Now, even if Husserl is wrong in his specifics, he shows that the proper basicality claim need not be a mere assertion. Moreover, we will see below that dualist intuitions of disembodiment are historically and geographically ubiquitous, and they are naturally formed by little children with no exposure to dualism or religious teaching, much less to ancient Greek philosophy. A good explanation for this is the fact that people have a direct awareness of their spiritual selves, a categorical intuition of their bodies qua being physical, and they become aware of their non-identity and the contingency of their relationship to each other. So people do not have strong intuitions for 3. Quite the contrary. In fact, many physicalists who believe three, that is, I'm identical to my body, acknowledge their intuitions against three remain. I agree with George Biola when he claimed, quote, belief is highly plastic. Not so for intuition, which I am using as a direct awareness of something or of being appeared to or a seeming. The phenomenal use of verbs like looks, seems, appears. All right, for nearly any proposition about which you have beliefs, authority, cajoling, intimidation, etc., fairly readily insinuate at least some doubt and thereby diminish to some extent, perhaps only briefly, the strength of your belief. But seldom, if ever, do these things so readily diminish the strength of your intuitions. Just try to diminish readily your intuition of the naive comprehension axiom, or your intuition that your favorite Gettier example could occur. Although there is disagreement about the degree of plasticity of intuitions, it is clear that as a family, they are inherently more resistant to such influences than are the associated beliefs. Now, I belabor the point about the importance of intuitions because their psychological stability, and as I will attempt to show below, their epistemic weight, factors into my purposes in two different ways. One, they provide support for my claim that the relevant referring terms in my modal argument should be taken in a de re and not a de dicto sense. And they provide defeaters against Merrick's claim that we have strong intuitions about certain things that support physicalism. More on these later. For now, I mention these claims about intuition to suggest that a dualist is within her epistemic rights in the absence of overriding defeaters to assert that 4 is properly basic and grounded in very strong modal seemings or intuitions without begging any questions. Later, I will give a fuller defense of these intuitions when I address the two issues above. One could respond that this only shows merely that the folk ontology of human beings includes the contingent fact that we are possibly, but not essentially, disembodiable. However, if that were the case, one would expect to find a fair number of children and adults, sans prior physicalist indoctrination, around the world expressing physicalist understandings of the afterlife. But that is not the case, because arguably, people intuit the kind of thing they are, essentially immaterial. Now, Merrick counters that dualist commitments to 4 rely on 7. It is necessarily true that a wholly physical body is a physical thing. As noted, I disagree and embrace a Husserlian type of account that 4 is epistemically grounded on the relevant seemings. But more importantly, in context, 7 is a de dicto claim with a wide scope for the modal operator. And the body seems to be a non-rigid designator. If that is correct, the correct understanding of 7, then if there is a propositional ground for 4, it isn't 7, but 7 prime. 7 prime. My body is necessarily, or more appropriately, essentially, a physical thing. Now here, my body and physical thing are rigid designators, and the premise involves de re necessity, with the modal operator exhibiting narrow scope. So Merrick's employment of 7 is mistaken, especially as an understanding of dualist thinking in presenting a modal argument. Now, one could respond to my argument by advancing some form of descriptivism. Roughly the idea that mental contents or linguistic entities, quote, directed towards, end quote, individuals, are definite descriptions that uniquely pick out those individuals that satisfy them. Thus, there just is no such thing as direct de re reference. After all, one cannot think about something, the response continues, unless one thinks of it as property in one way or another. And the descriptive mental content expresses the unique way the referent is so property. In reply, it is obvious I cannot undertake a suitable evaluation of descriptivism here. but it is important to defend de re reference and its relationship to modal seemings and intuitions in cases relevant to my modal argument. Walter Hopp notes that this objection, that I'm coming from descriptivism, notes that this objection is based on a confused understanding of what direct de re reference does and does not entail. For one thing, it is a false dichotomy to hold that directly referential terms, e.g. proper names and natural kind terms, or categorical expressions, either have descriptive meaning and therefore are not directly referential, or have no sense at all. Instead, such terms have descriptive and directly referential non-descriptive aspects. These would be called moments, or dependent parts, more technically. For example, while one cannot entertain demonstrative thoughts about a chair directly in front of one without being aware of at least some of its features, that does not entail that there is no non-descriptive, directly referential element inherent in true demonstrative reference. Moreover, just because one must think of, say, New York, and I hope one doesn't have to think of New York, but if you must, in a certain way, to think about it, it doesn't follow that one thinks of New York via a uniquely satisfied definite description, viz., as just whatever unique properties one thinks New York to have. One can directly refer to New York and keep in mind, as one varies the properties one thinks New York to have. Keep it in mind as you vary the properties you think it to have. As Hopp notes, ultimately, the difference between thinking of something directly and thinking of it as just whatever has such and such properties is phenomenologically evident. But thinking about something directly is not incompatible with thinking of it in some way or through some with respect to some sense. Now, Edmund Husserl clarified this claim quite precisely. Husserl began his account of intentionality and de re reference by bracketing the natural attitude in favor of the phenomenological attitude. This meant that he set aside scientific considerations about the existence and nature of the physical world due to his conviction that when it comes to the realm of consciousness and the self, quote, natural cognition begins with experience and remains within experience. So he was an epistemic internalist of the fullest sort. For Husserl, the phenomenological exploration of consciousness is strictly a first-person endeavor. In his account of intentionality, he held that every intentional experience is constituted by two independently variable yet inseparable moments, that is, a dependent part or property instance, a matter and a quality. The act quality is roughly what we mean today by the attitude in propositional attitudes. The quality is what grounds the intentional act as a judging, hoping, merely experiential, etc. one. More important is Husserl's assay of an intentional experience as matter. This is not to be confused with scientific ordinary matter. He tended to coin his own terms and gave them his own meaning. The matter gives the intentional act its directedness towards an object and consists in a referring to the object in a specific manner. It fixes reference on this very object in this very manner. And put differently, the matter included a reference to an intentional object and the manner in which it is attended. The former stands to the latter as determinable to determinate. The matter presents the object in a specific way. The quality and matter of an intentional act are the act's intentional essence. And in purely intuitive acts, perceptual, eidetic, categorical, the intentional essence is entirely non-conceptual. In such acts, the non-descriptive, directly referential elements secure de re reference. Finally, Husserl held that intentionality is a monadic property and not a relation. Among other things, this permits him to avoid hunting around for a surrogate object, say one's own concept and hexaity and so forth, in cases where one is aware of or thinking about a non-existent object, like Zeus. A surrogate that is clearly not the intended intentional object. Zeus could throw thunderbolts, but my concept of Zeus is disgustingly unable to do that. Happ also observes that since Seller's attack on the myth of the given, there's been a widespread consensus that reasons-giving relations hold among only mental states whose intentional contents are conceptual or propositional. Thus, perceptual or non-perceptual intuitive states must include conceptual propositional content. Happ calls this experiential conceptualism, and while it may not entail the reduction of de re to de dicto reference, minimally, experiential conceptualism is hard to square with de dicto, direct de dicto reference, and our epistemically justified confidence in its success. But it fits quite nicely with de re reference. Given these claims by Husserl, and Campbell should be crossed out, it is quite plausible to hold that all de dicto intentionality is grounded in de re intentionality, since the latter always involves a genuine direct reference to some specific individual property, relation, etc., such that the epistemic justification of the de dicto expression requires the referent to show up in person in some sense, being directly present or given to the referring subject in the fulfilling act. In this way, purely non-conceptual, intuitive, e.g. Perceptual, intentional states are reason-giving with respect to relevant conceptual propositional content, in that the former are the fulfillment of the latter. And so experience can ground propositional content, and pure experience can be reasons-giving. Thus, a properly basic belief in most versions of foundationalism do not have further propositional beliefs that justify them, but it doesn't mean they're unjustified. They could be justified for the internalist by an experience, a seeming, an awareness of some kind. And I think that's important. In my view, these remarks about the relationship between de re and de dicto reference, experiential conceptualism, and so forth, provide good grounds for rejecting Merrick's preference for de dicto treatments of the relevant referring expressions in my modal argument. I acknowledge that many philosophers who embrace experiential conceptualism favor de dicto interpretations of these expressions over my adoption of them in de re terms. My hope is that this brief exploration into Husserl proffers reasons to reconsider their position, along with their understanding and assessment of the modal argument. At the very least, this exploration shows that I'm not begging the question in my treatment of 4, and my body is essentially a physical thing. There are grounds for that. Moreover, the case I have presented over the last few pages provides reasons to hold that de re reference is basic and not derivative, as is de dicto reference. Thus, at the very least, my remarks provide prima facie defeaters for Merrick's case against 2 in my modal argument. Here's an additional objection to Merrick's employment of contingent physicalism as a defeater of 2. In criticizing Van Inwagen's simulacrum hypothesis, Merrick says that even if there is a possible world in which Van Inwagen's view is 2, nevertheless in the actual world, it's the actual world we're concerned about, and his view is false in the actual world. Analogously, he claims that 2 of his argument implies there's a possible world in which I am wholly immaterial, but that world is not the actual one. On pain of inconsistency, it would seem that Merrick's rejoinder to Van Inwagen applies with equal force to his rebuttal of my modal argument. Consistency would seem to imply that our fundamental interests are about what we are in the actual world, not some other possible world. And if we limit our focus accordingly, then it would seem that premise 2 of the modal argument would go through if the scope of the modal argument is limited to those worlds relevantly similar to the actual world. It would be question-begging for Merrick's to appeal to a depiction of us as POs in the actual world. But advocates of the modal argument do not assume substance dualism epistemically if, for the sake of argument, they index the relevant notions into, essentially, wholly intrinsically, to a range of possible worlds relevantly similar to the actual world. The reason this is true is that the justification for 2 and 3 are the relevant non-conceptual seemings that are ubiquitously present among the peoples in these worlds. Now, to support this claim, it is important to observe that people did not create the idea of a soul as a part of their theorizing about the world. Their theorizing about the world actually employed and extended what they already pre-theoretically and pre-linguistically knew by direct acquaintance. Common sense substance dualism is an expression of what Jesse Behrings calls a folk psychology of souls, not mythology. And another psychologist says all peoples have beliefs about various types of souls that are responsible for the liveliness of the body as well as for various cognitive emotional functions. Since such conceptions thus cannot be analyzed merely at the level of their linguistic expressions and are not spread only through cultural contacts. He goes on to explain that anthropological data of early cultures says this: although humans may have lacked doctrines and narratives about souls, they must have had an intuitive idea about them. Otherwise, even a rudimentary form of religion would not have been possible. So the soul is not the result of thinking about accepting religion. Accepting a religion as plausible is because we already know that we're not physical and there could possibly be an afterlife, and so we search for a religion that makes sense of that. At least that's what the argument that the psychologists are making. After a detailed analysis, Raymond Martin and John Baresi conclude that common sense substance dualism, quote, did not even begin with the Greeks or Hebrews or even the Egyptians. Rather, it began much earlier, perhaps with the Neanderthals, end quote. In my view, people's notion of an afterlife was already justified as a possibility because of the account of dualist seemings we've considered: direct acquaintance with oneself and conscious states. And these dualist seemings were subsequently pressed into service, not the other way around. These claims accord well with the prevailing view among cognitive scientists that dualism is a widespread, pre-theoretical, including non-religious belief, shared across cultures and developed in infancy. We are, as Paul Bloom says, natural Cartesians. In my view, the best explanation of these data is that people are simply aware of their own selves, recognize its non-identity to anything physical, and form modal intuitions about disembodied afterlife existence. These ubiquitous observations not only provide a basis for claiming that direct intuitive awareness is foundational, natural, and hard to dismiss among peoples all over the world, they also make Merrick's claim that we have strong modal intuitions against dualism and for physicalism. It makes that very difficult to take seriously unless Merrick's limits the scope of we to him and his physicalist colleagues. Moreover, even if we grant that we have modal intuitions against causal interaction, the evidence cited above supports the rejoinder that we have significant overriding defeater intuitions to those about the interaction problem. My third response to Merrick's rests on the idea that modal intuitions, especially as understood by Husserl and me, are of kinds of objects. The kind pure ego and the subcategorial kind physical object. Merrick's could reject this as irrelevant, but he shoulders a burden of proof here, since most philosophers and lay people find contingent physicalism to be unacceptable because POs and SSs are just not the kinds of objects that could be characterized by contingent physicalism. David Lewis is not the only one who must face an incredulous stare here. Merrick's also needs to interact with modal epistemologies like Husserl before he is entitled to treat the relevant referring terms in de dicto ways. How might a contingent physicalist respond? I think the best line would be to say that identity, including the identity of a complex object, is brute and ungrounded. It is the object itself, a PO or spiritual substance, that is identical in the two worlds, and that's that. Unfortunately, this claim comes very close to begging the question. And I'm going to skip down to the next paragraph because of time. Further, I think the following claim is ambiguous. Identity is never grounded. Each thing is what it is and not something else is about all one can say on the matter, including the identity of complexes, so the search for a ground is misguided. Now, if this means that the identity relation is primitive and irreducible to other relations, exact similarity, let's say, then I agree. The identity relation is primitive. But I suspect that isn't what's being affirmed here. I think it means that there is no reductive analysis of cases of identity themselves. In those cases, identity is what it is, and consequently uninformative. Now, a good place to begin evaluating this interpretation is the debate over diachronic personal identity between advocates of the complex and simple views. One criticism of the simple view is that by taking PI to be primitive and brute, the simple view is uninformative and merely an assertion of diachronic identity. Now, this criticism is confused in that it conflates a reductive analysis of diachronic identity with an ontological assay of the entities that retain it. The simple view does entail that no reductive analysis of personal identity, e.g. in non-personal terms involving sortal-dependent psychological or bodily persistence conditions, is adequate. Fair enough. But this does not entail that a case of diachronic identity is uninformative, because in each case, particularly cases of wholes that are metaphysically complex and mariologically simple with respect to separable parts, an ontological assay may be given of the entity that retains identity to understand what must be the case for the identity to obtain. For example, a simple advocate could say that PI is identity of a specific type of soul, and moreover, that the identity of that sort of thing requires identity of its constituents. For example, the essence, human personhood, the nexus of exemplification, and primitive thisness, for example, a bare particular. Such an assay retains the basicality of identity itself and provides a non-reductive ontological inventory of the relevant complex entities and insight as to what must stay the same for the entity to remain the same. Last paragraph. I've tried to show that contingent physicalism fails as a defeater of premise 2 of the modal argument. After stating and clarifying my version of the argument, I present arguments from contingent physicalist Trenton Merrick's that are intended to be defeaters of premise 2 of the argument. I also give reasons for thinking that these arguments fail as defeaters. The reader or listener may not agree with my arguments, but since contingent physicalism is on the rise, it is important for there to be critical discussions of the view and its employment as a defeater against a popular argument for substance dualism. Thank you.